Male concubinage wasn't just a hidden footnote in ancient history, but was a widespread institution that shaped the lives of countless young men across multiple civilizations for over 2,000 years. Most people today imagine these arrangements as simple tales of exploitation, focusing on the sensational aspects that Hollywood and orientalist literature have popularized. But behind that surface understanding was something far more intricate and politically significant than modern expectations might suggest. These young men often became some of the most powerful individuals in their respective empires, wielding influence that could topple dynasties or forge new political alliances. In this video, we'll explore 5 shocking aspects of what really happened to boys chosen as male concubines, and the final revelation will surprise you. The recruitment of young males for court service operated through systematic networks that spanned continents and lasted centuries. The Ottoman devshirme system legally required Christian families in the Balkans to provide 1 son in 5 for palace training between the 14th and 17th centuries. Officials arrived in villages with the precision of tax collectors, examining boys aged 8 to 14 for intelligence, physical beauty, and capacity for loyalty. Parents sometimes bribed these collectors to take their children, understanding that palace life offered education and advancement impossible in rural communities. The criteria went far beyond appearance. Persian courts sought boys who could master multiple languages within months, while Chinese emperors valued those who demonstrated musical talent alongside administrative skills. Byzantine recruiters prioritized candidates from noble families whose connections might prove useful in future diplomatic negotiations. The Safavid court of Shah Abbas maintained detailed records of each recruit's background, tracking family lineages to ensure a diverse mix of ethnicities and regional loyalties within the palace hierarchy. These weren't desperate sweeps through villages, but calculated investments in human capital. A Georgian boy might cost equivalent to 50 horses, while a Circassian youth with exceptional beauty could command prices exceeding annual tax revenues from entire provinces. The expense reflected their expected returns. These children would become translators, administrators, military commanders, and confidential advisors, whose decisions affected millions of subjects. Training began immediately upon arrival at court. Ottoman palace schools provided education in mathematics, languages, poetry, and statecraft that surpassed anything available in European universities of the same period. Chinese academies taught calligraphy, philosophy, and military strategy, alongside more specialized skills like perfume preparation and musical composition. The curriculum deliberately created well-rounded individuals capable of serving multiple functions within complex governmental structures. The selection process proved so effective that rival empires began copying Ottoman methods, creating an international trade in talented boys whose abilities transcended the boundaries of individual kingdoms, establishing networks that would influence global politics for generations. Daily existence within palace walls demanded mastering an intricate balance between submission and initiative that few adults could have navigated successfully. Young pages woke before dawn to begin grooming rituals involving expensive oils, silk garments, and cosmetic applications that could take hours to complete properly. They memorized the preferences of dozens of court officials while learning to anticipate needs before they were expressed, developing an almost supernatural ability to read facial expressions and interpret silences. The educational component consumed most daylight hours. Chinese palace schools required students to copy thousands of characters daily while simultaneously studying military tactics and diplomatic protocols. Ottoman academies taught European languages alongside Islamic theology, preparing graduates for roles requiring cultural translation between different imperial systems. Persian institutions emphasized poetry and artistic creation, producing young men who could compose verses celebrating military victories or mourning dynastic losses with equal facility. Evening responsibilities varied dramatically, based on individual assignments and personal relationships with specific officials. Some boys served as secretaries during private meetings where state secrets were discussed openly, recording decisions that would affect entire provinces while maintaining absolute discretion about everything they witnessed. Others provided entertainment through music, storytelling, or conversation during informal gatherings where the real business of empire often took place. The physical demands extended beyond ceremonial functions to include genuine administrative responsibilities. A 14-year-old might manage correspondence between provincial governors, while simultaneously overseeing kitchen staff responsible for elaborate banquets attended by foreign ambassadors. These dual roles required developing organizational skills that many modern executives would struggle to master. Sleep came infrequently and rarely involved complete rest. Palace servants remained on call throughout the night for emergency summons, developing chronic alertness that persisted long after their formal service ended. The psychological conditioning created individuals who functioned effectively under constant pressure while learning to suppress normal emotional responses that might interfere with their duties. Yet this demanding lifestyle also provided unparalleled access to power centers and decision-making processes that shaped historical events, setting the stage for career opportunities that would astonish contemporary observers. Career advancement for successful palace graduates created some of history's most dramatic social transformations, while establishing precedents that influenced governmental structures across multiple civilizations. The Byzantine Empire systematically promoted former pages to positions including military commanders, provincial governors, and even patriarchs of Constantinople. By the 10th century, castrated men controlled nearly every major governmental office, creating an administrative class whose loyalty derived entirely from imperial favor rather than family connections or regional allegiances. Bagoas exemplified these possibilities, rising from Persian court servant to become vizier under Artaxerxes III, wielding power that exceeded most regional kings. His success stemmed not from traditional military or aristocratic credentials, but from understanding how personality dynamics influence policy decisions, knowledge gained through years of observing private conversations and witnessing unguarded moments when powerful men revealed their true motivations and fears. The Ottoman system institutionalized such advancement through formal graduation ceremonies, where successful pages received administrative appointments throughout the empire. These men governed territories from Hungary to Yemen, implementing policies shaped by their shared palace experiences and maintaining communication networks that transcended geographical boundaries. Their common background created unofficial coordination mechanisms that enhanced imperial efficiency while ensuring continued loyalty to the central dynasty. Chinese courts developed even more sophisticated tracking systems, maintaining lifetime records of former palace servants and strategically deploying them based on evolving political needs. Emperors arranged marriages between graduates and noble families, creating kinship networks that bound provincial elites to the imperial household through personal relationships rather than mere legal obligations. These matrimonial alliances produced children whose mixed heritage embodied the cultural synthesis that characterized Chinese imperial expansion. Military leadership represented another major pathway for advancement. The Janissary Corps, originally recruited through the Devshirme system, became Europe's most feared fighting force for 3 centuries. These former palace servants understood both combat techniques and court psychology, enabling them to coordinate military campaigns with political objectives more effectively than traditional warrior classes who lacked diplomatic sophistication. The promotion systems created paradoxical situations where men who had once served wine while kneeling might later return to the same palaces as governors or generals, technically equal in rank to their former masters. Rather than generating resentment, these relationships typically strengthened imperial cohesion by demonstrating that merit and loyalty could overcome initial social disadvantages. Success required maintaining delicate balances between acknowledging past subordination and asserting current authority, skills that proved invaluable for managing diverse populations and complex administrative challenges throughout expanding empires. The political influence exercised by former palace servants often exceeded that of queens, generals, and religious leaders combined, creating shadow governments that operated through networks invisible to most contemporary observers. During the Tang dynasty, Emperor Xuanzong's male favorites gained such authority that they effectively controlled imperial appointments and policy decisions, transforming personal relationships into systematic governmental control that bypassed traditional bureaucratic channels entirely. This power derived from emotional dependencies rather than formal constitutional arrangements. Palace-trained advisors understood how their sovereigns thought during private moments of vulnerability, enabling them to frame policy proposals in terms that appealed to personal psychology rather than abstract political theory. They knew which arguments would trigger favorable responses and which advisors held genuine influence during crucial decision-making periods. Provincial governors learned to cultivate relationships with these unofficial power brokers rather than following normal administrative procedures, understanding that advancement required approval from men whose authority stemmed from bedroom conversations rather than public appointments. This created parallel governmental structures where real decisions happened in private chambers before being announced in formal councils. The Persian Safavid court institutionalized such influence by creating official positions that could only be held by men with previous palace experience. These roles carried impressive titles and substantial administrative responsibilities while maintaining the understanding that their holders owed their positions to personal relationships rather than public qualifications. The system produced remarkably effective coordination between different governmental departments whose officials shared common backgrounds and mutual trust. Byzantine chroniclers documented similar patterns during the empire's Golden Age, when eunuch administrators controlled military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, and economic policies simultaneously. Their shared palace experiences created communication networks that enabled rapid policy implementation and strategic coordination across vast territories. Foreign ambassadors quickly learned to identify these influential figures and direct their diplomatic efforts accordingly. The effectiveness of these informal systems stemmed from their flexibility and personal nature. Unlike rigid bureaucratic hierarchies that responded slowly to changing circumstances, palace networks could adapt quickly to new challenges by leveraging personal relationships and shared experiences. During military crises or diplomatic emergencies, former palace servants could coordinate responses with remarkable speed and efficiency. However, this same personal foundation also created vulnerabilities that would eventually contribute to systemic instability when emotional relationships replaced rational decision-making processes during critical historical moments. The psychological conditioning required for palace survival created men who were simultaneously highly capable and profoundly altered, developing characteristics that persisted throughout their adult lives, regardless of their later achievements or social positions. Chinese court physicians documented specific behavioral patterns among former palace servants, including chronic insomnia, compulsive grooming habits, and inability to form emotional attachments with equals. These men had learned during childhood that survival required constant vigilance and emotional detachment, skills that proved valuable for administrative work but devastating for personal relationships. Former Ottoman pages frequently continued elaborate daily grooming rituals decades after leaving palace service, unable to abandon practices that had become psychological necessities rather than mere court requirements. They maintained the same standards of personal appearance that had once determined their safety, treating their bodies as perpetual displays, requiring constant maintenance and improvement. Many hoarded money and resources despite having access to substantial wealth, retaining survival instincts developed during years when their master's displeasure could mean immediate destitution. Their relationships with family members revealed the deepest costs of their earlier experiences. Men who could govern provinces or command armies often proved incapable of normal parental affection, treating their children with calculated emotional distance learned through years of palace service. They frequently chose spouses based entirely on political advantage, having lost the capacity to distinguish between genuine emotion and strategic alliance. The most tragic aspect was their inability to escape psychological patterns that had ensured survival during youth. Even when achieving positions where they could theoretically act independently, they continued seeking approval from authority figures and measuring their worth through external validation rather than internal satisfaction. Their greatest professional achievements often felt hollow because they had learned to define success entirely through pleasing others rather than fulfilling personal desires. Yet this same conditioning enabled extraordinary political effectiveness. Their training in reading human behavior, anticipating needs, and managing complex social dynamics made them ideally suited for administrative roles requiring diplomatic sensitivity and strategic thinking. They could navigate court politics with sophistication that traditional aristocrats often lacked, understanding power dynamics through lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. The combination of exceptional competence and emotional detachment created individuals uniquely qualified for governmental leadership, but permanently isolated from normal human connections, establishing a pattern that would influence administrative cultures for centuries after the original palace systems disappeared. The elimination of male concubinage systems across different civilizations followed similar patterns, as modernization pressures made traditional loyalty networks obsolete and politically dangerous. European military advances during the 17th and 18th centuries forced Asian empires to adopt professional armies equipped with standardized weapons and trained according to rational tactical principles rather than personal devotion to individual commanders. The Ottoman Empire began restricting palace recruitment after repeated military defeats demonstrated that emotional loyalty could not compete with technological superiority and systematic training methods. Traditional palace education systems produced administrators skilled in cultural diplomacy, but lacking technical knowledge required for managing modern artillery, navigation equipment, and industrial production facilities. Chinese dynasties abandoned the practice following scandals where former palace favorites manipulated succession disputes and corrupted governmental appointments through personal influence rather than merit-based selection. The Anlushan rebellion during the Tang dynasty, partly attributed to excessive imperial reliance on male companions, demonstrated how emotional dependencies could destabilize entire empires when personal psychology overrode strategic thinking. Western colonial expansion accelerated these changes by introducing governmental concepts that emphasized legal frameworks over personal relationships. European administrators viewed traditional court systems as obstacles to efficient colonial management, using economic and military pressure to force adoption of bureaucratic structures based on written procedures rather than individual loyalty networks. The rise of nationalism further undermined systems based on personal devotion to individual rulers. Populations that had previously accepted governance by men whose authority derived from private relationships began demanding accountability to broader public interests rather than palace dynamics. Modern concepts of citizenship made personal loyalty systems appear illegitimate and archaic. Economic factors also contributed to decline as traditional revenue sources proved inadequate for financing both modern military forces and elaborate court establishments. Rulers facing European technological challenges could no longer afford supporting hundreds of pages whose primary function involved providing personal companionship and political coordination. The transformation occurred gradually over several generations, as former palace servants found their influence diminishing while new administrative classes emerged with different qualifications and loyalties. Technical experts, military professionals, and legal scholars replaced culturally sophisticated courtiers, marking the end of governmental systems based on personal relationships and cultural refinement. Male concubinage didn't happen by accident, but occurred because it solved specific problems that traditional political systems couldn't address effectively. The situation wasn't simply about personal indulgence, but represented sophisticated responses to fundamental challenges of creating loyalty in societies where family and tribal connections threatened centralized authority. These relationships provided rulers with advisors whose allegiance derived entirely from imperial favor rather than competing power networks. The system wasn't disguised exploitation but genuinely transformative by design in societies where social mobility remained otherwise impossible. These arrangements offered selected young men pathways to influence and wealth that no other institution could provide, while simultaneously serving practical needs of complex states requiring skilled administrators with unquestioned loyalty. The people involved didn't just endure these relationships, but developed them into lasting political influence through systematic cultivation of informal power networks. In the end, their true legacy was not in surface-level personal arrangements, but in their fundamental transformation of how empires governed themselves through emotional connections operating parallel to official structures. For many civilizations, that lasting impact was everything, creating governance models that shaped policy decisions, military campaigns, and succession disputes for centuries after the original relationships had ended. proving that political power could flow through carefully cultivated personal bonds as effectively as through traditional institutional hierarchies.